When you have a debate like this, particularly involving a respected climate scientist, which Professor Dessler is, I think the usual assumption is that there's going to be big differences over climate science. And for the most part, I think that's not true. I think the key difference here between not just me and Professor Dessler, but between me and the whole net zero movement is methodology. My background is philosophy. I think a lot about methodology. And I have a very particular methodology for thinking about this issue. I don't know where to point this. And what's interesting about this methodology is nobody has ever disagreed with this methodology, and yet I've never met one opponent of fossil fuels who even remotely follows it. So let me just explain it. There are four key factors we have to consider when thinking about fossil fuels and climate. We need to think about the harms of rising CO2. We need to think about the benefits of rising CO2. We need to think about what I call climate mastery, our ability to master or adapt to any kind of climate danger, and then the benefits of fossil fuels. And so my analysis is that usually what happens with the net zero movement is they do talk a lot about rising CO2 harms. They tend to overstate them. I think Professor Dessler does that less than others, although even already he's done a little bit of distortion in that realm. Rising CO2 benefits tend to be trivialized or denied. Climate mastery denial tends to not be discussed at all. And then fossil fuel benefit denial is rampant. And I'll show that Professor Dessler is doing this despite seeming not to. So I'm going to go through each of these factors, explain my view, and explain where Professor Dessler and then the net zero view just go very wrong. So I'm going to start off with the harm. So I generally find Professor Dessler reasonable. I think he's one of the more honest commentators. What he and the IPCC say is nothing resembling what we hear in the media. For example, with sea level rises, you're talking like 3 feet by the year 2100 in extreme scenarios, not like 20 feet in several decades like Al Gore talks about. And on Joe Rogan, he said explicitly, we have no idea in terms of what 3 degrees C will do. And I cannot tell you it's going to be bad, but I think it could be bad. So I think that's a kind of measured thing. When we talk about degrees Fahrenheit, though, it's important to recognize we're already up 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you talk about 5 degrees or 10 degrees, I don't like that. I think we need to be more honest about that. So if you're talking about 5 degrees, it really means 3 degrees from now, and today is the most amazing world that has ever existed. And so that brings us to rising CO2 benefits, which even if you think the harms are big, the benefits are demonstrably huge, particularly fewer cold-related deaths. Far more people die of cold than heat in the world. We have Bjorn Lomborg here, and I'm using his chart, which has been vetted many times and attacked unfairly many times. There's also global greening in terms of crops benefiting a lot. And this is very significant, often measured in the trillions of dollars. So the fact that this is not mentioned or acknowledged as significant by the net zero movement shows a kind of bias that we're going to see much more apparently with climate mastery. And here's where we really get into problems with that view. It is a fact that climate-related disaster deaths, so from extreme temperatures, storms, floods, wildfires, and drought, are down 98% over the last century. And it is also demonstrable that fossil fuels, which provide 80% of the low-cost, reliable energy we use to master climate, that they are a key cause. For example, using fossil fuels to power irrigation and transport to make us far safer from drought. Our mastery is so great that 100 million people in the world live below high tide sea level. Or they live, so I mean, in terms of like the sea level for 100 million people, they're below it and they're totally fine. So here's what I find totally objectionable. This is never mentioned. The IPCC does not mention it. It's got thousands of pages. It does not mention it. Professor Dessler, I've never seen him mention it. He doesn't mention it here. This is like discussing polio and the effects of polio without discussing the fact that we have a polio vaccine. We are masters of climate. To not discuss this is climate mastery denial, pure and simple. And nothing, I want to really emphasize this, nothing a climate mastery denier projects about future harms of CO2 can be trusted because they deny our climate mastery ability. This applies to the IPCC reports, certainly applies to Professor Dessler. And so the final factor, which is an even more egregious denial, if that is possible, is denying the benefits of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are a uniquely scalable and versatile source of energy. Scalable means provide energy for billions of people in thousands of places. Versatile means all types of machines. You might have noticed Professor Dessler only talked about electricity, but electricity is only 20% of global energy use. Fossil fuels are growing, particularly in China and other parts of the world that want the lowest cost, most reliable energy. It's curious why China is not going all in on solar, given that it's so allegedly cheap. And if we look at solar and wind, if we look at the actual performance around the world, it's very, very clear. They're only used in places that have large subsidies and mandates, and they add costs. So when you see more solar and wind, the electricity prices go up. Now, why is this? It's very simple. You look at this graph of Germany, and you see that sometimes solar and wind can go to zero. What does that mean? That means you need 100% backup. So you have to pay for the cost of the 100% reliable grid and all the unreliable infrastructure, including transmission lines, but most importantly, the reliable power plants. When you try to cut costs on reliable power plants or resiliency measures, which is what happened in Texas or where I live in California, then you have disasters. On top of this, billions more people need low-cost, reliable energy, like the 1/3 of the world using wood and animal dung. So fossil fuels are uniquely cost-effective, and yet Professor Dessler says it's low cost to rapidly eliminate them. How can he claim this? Well, he's using two denial tactics that either he's unaware of or he's being very manipulative. And these are called partial cost accounting and then relying on near-term impossibilities. So partial cost accounting, he used this levelized cost of energy / electricity. Anyone who uses this is either ignorant or defrauding you, and I mean this very literally. If you look at the actual number, it says explicitly, does not take into account reliability-related considerations. So it only looks at basically the cost of the solar panels, but not the transmission lines and not the backup. That's like saying, I've got a really cheap employee. He's only $18 an hour instead of $20 an hour, but yeah, you have to pay to bus him into work, and that's expensive, and you have to pay for 100% reliable staff, but $18 an hour, it's so cheap, right? You need to look at the full cost. This is partial cost accounting. And then in terms of near-term impossibilities, Professor Dessler often talks about nuclear, hydro, and geothermal in terms of supporting this magical grid. So nuclear doesn't work with intermittent solar and wind. Nuclear is the red one on the bottom. It works very steadily. It doesn't work with intermittency. Gas, the tan one, is the one that goes up and down. Hydro is location limited. Professor Dessler also recently said, I agree that hydro is not something to expand. And then geothermal is highly location limited. It's a fraction of a percent. It's not practical. So either we're dealing with a tremendous amount of ignorance about energy, he has some fantastic argument that I've never heard of, or he's engaging in deliberate deception. And if somebody is distorting the present, they cannot be trusted to predict the future. So I look forward to engaging these issues, but Dr. Dessler has a lot to answer for.
Alex, if you could wrap it up. Thank you. Oh, perfect timing. Great. Thank you both, gentlemen.